So it's really great to have the two of you with us here for BCAF, and Jason Reeves, Andre Owens. Let's just jump into this. Tell us about Black Indie Comix Distro.
Okay. Andre.
Okay, well, Black Indie Comix Distro, we put it together when we realized that there wasn't an outlet. Let me back up. What happens is we go to conventions, and when you're at a convention, you get people coming to our tables, and they're amazed that there's all these different types of Black indie comics out there. You know, they've only heard of Black Panther or Falcon or these things. So they come to a convention, and to a person, and Jason can say it's true, you get people say, like, we didn't know all this is here. We never heard of this. We never did this. So we were like, how can we reach that audience? What can we do to get our indie comics into more hands? And that's when we decided to come up with Black Indie Comix Distro, to try to get, Black indie comics into comic book stores' hands.
Right. Bookstores, barbershops, what have you. We definitely want to go where that audience that's looking for Black comics and what we're putting out there, wherever they are, we want to have the apparatus to go there. So that's why we thought, oh, well, let's create something with a distribution bent. Like we do, we each of us individually do our own publishing, or we, get book deals or whatever, but there's no specific apparatus for the Black comics industry. Some people that focus on Black comics, and we wanted to, I guess we had to create that.
Well, and this is what's really interesting, because most people who read comics, they don't think about right? Distribution. What is that? So let's talk a little bit about distribution. I'll lead in with a little bit of prehistory, right? When people talk about distribution, they're talking about how the comic books get to, how they're distributed to the audience, right? And I mean, in the U.S., comic distribution is really interesting, because when comics first came out, they were part of the magazine distribution system. That's how they showed up on newsstands, at the pharmacy. Back then, you didn't have a CVS, but you had pharmacies. You had Piggly Wiggly. You had all sorts of places where they had the spinner racks that some of us old folks remember, or some of us young folks like me, we saw them in a museum somewhere. But I'd love for you guys to tell me more about that old stuff. But the thing about the newsstand was that the distribution system was different, in that when the newsstand received a comic, if it didn't sell in like 30 to 60 days, they could rip the cover off and they could send it back, and they would get credit towards the next order. And so that meant that they had to place these orders that were much, much bigger than what they would actually sell. And then came the direct market, which is what most of us are familiar with, where you have comic shops. The difference with the comic shop is that the comic shop, they actually purchased the book. Right. So they purchased the book from the distributor. Diamond is the biggest distributor right now. We don't have to go into all of the details, but they purchase the book from Diamond. Diamond delivers the books, and if they don't sell them, they just hold on to it. Yeah. But what that also means is that's how we develop the collector's market, because the books go from the shelves to the back issues bin, right? Right. And that's a lot. That's most of they call them floppy comics. A floppy comic is something like this. It's a comic, right? That's what we traditionally think of as a comic. So now that we've got a little bit of prehistory back in, we got a little ancient knowledge here. So tell me, why wasn't this good enough for you guys?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, well, you alluded to it, to a point about Diamond. Diamond is a monopoly, basically. I mean, I guess there was in my life, there's been other distributors that did comics, but once Steve Jeppy monopolized the market, it kind of pushed all this out. It's like when I first started doing my first indie comic, Force Galaxia, I created it, I submitted it to Diamond, and they rejected it, just like they did thousands of other people, because they have the power to do that. and it kept, kept people out of the market. It really did. It kept the market very small. I mean, if you get like each month the Diamond sends out a magazine called Previews, and in that magazine it has all of the different comics that are available from the companies that they carry, but they can restrict who gets in their book. So what it is, and I'm not saying there was any racial component per se, because I'm sure there's a lot of white or Asian or Latino creators that can't get their books in Diamond either. But our idea was that we have to find a way to be able to get indie comics out to people's hands. We have to find a way to bridge that gap between us indies and the audience.
Well,
So,
I think Diamond's audience serves a certain portion of the direct market of the comic book industry, right? And we know that traditionally that is leaned, white, male, age group, like 18 to 54 or whatever. So depending on the demand coming from that group, it's harder for our stuff to get past the gatekeepers at Diamond or whatever, or the other one or the other distributors. So I definitely wanted to do something that focused on people like me, creators like me rather, that couldn't get through those channels, or didn't have the right networking to get through those channels, and that's really the reason why we wanted to kind of use our resources to create that. I think like there is a racial component, not necessarily from individuals, but from the system in general.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
So okay, it was difficult accessing Diamond. So
Right.
So what, as independent comic creators, how did you get your stuff out to? How did you sell your stuff? How did you get it out to people? Back in the olden days, before you embarked on this.
In the olden days,
the
olden days, I didn't get comics out to anybody. But with the advent of the internet, we can use social media and those channels to kind of connect with our audience, right? So, my publishing company is 133 Art, right? And I've been publishing since 2012, and the only reason that was possible was because I could connect via like Facebook and eventually Instagram and Twitter with people who might want to read a story about a Black superhero who can lift helicopters, right? Now Andre's old, so he might know.
No, I actually started doing my the first time I started doing my comic was the late 90s when I started writing it, so it has been a long time.
Right.
But I didn't publish until 2006, and my first convention was Wizard World LA. But yeah, there wasn't. I mean, those early days. I mean, say early days. It was only 14 years ago. But before the advent of social media, as big as it was very difficult to connect. I mean, I had a website up, and I wasn't getting views. There was no easy way to advertise. So it does make a difference with social media. I mean, now I've got a built-in fan audience. My newest book is The Bovine League, about genetically altered superpowered cows. I've got a worldwide fan base of that now,
Yep.
that people love it for, all over the place. I get emails constantly from people who read the PDF, or now that the physical copies are going out, read the physical copies, so yeah.
Well, and I think that's interesting. What the way you guys are talking about the importance of just being able to develop and grow an audience online, right? So you're describing sales that are essentially online sales, like you're receiving the orders online, and then you're sending them on, you're sending them electronically, or you're bagging them and schlepping over to the post office.
Right.
What about comic conventions? Where have they fit into all of this?
Well, comic conventions have been a big part of our sales, especially when you know, for 133 Art, we figured out that that was a good avenue to connect physically with our audience. So yeah, we totally have like the BCAF in general.
Right.
Like when you guys started, we were at the first show, and man, on Martin Luther King Day, and like a lot of people. I remember that first show, there was the march through the hall, and we connected with a ton of people who didn't even know, again, that we existed and we were creating content that they might be interested in. So comic conventions are a big part of it. Also at comic conventions, you can talk to actual store owners who are there selling books and connect with those guys as well. So yeah, we neglected it earlier, but comic conventions are a big part of that as well.
Yeah, and it's just getting to meet people, and actually getting to physically meet your fans, and getting to talk to people, getting the feedback is so important at comic conventions. It's so important about knowing what your audience. I mean, I don't particularly write to an audience, but it is nice to know what your audience likes. It is nice to know to get out there and speak to someone instead of just having to make an assumption about these people like this or these people like that. I mean, I tend to write what I want to see myself, because that's the beauty of indie comics. But I also have in mind, my audience that I'm writing, that does read my books.
Totally.
Awesome. And so I mean, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but what's your favorite comic convention?
Favorite?
Well, it's funny. I've done a lot of them. Yeah, of course.
I mean, I'm just curious. I just want to know what the best one is in the world, and I figured the two of you are experts.
I will say BCAF is amazing, especially like, again, that's such a great memory the first year when the march comes through the hall, right? Like amazing. I had never seen anything like that before, especially as like a newbie. There are a few really good indie Black centered comic cons these days. There's MegaCon in Detroit. There's you guys. There's Black Comic Fest in New York at the Schomburg. There's Black Comic Book Day in San Diego, which last year, before this whole COVID thing kicked off, was off the hook. Like that was the last show I did, actually. Oh, really? Black Comics Day, yeah. Year 3, it's done by a guy named Keithan Jones, and he also has his own comic imprint called Kid Comics, and that is definitely one of my faves to do every year. One, it's close, so I can drive down, and two, just watching him build it from scratch is an amazing thing to see. Because the first year we did okay, but in year 3, man, there were like I want to say 1,000 to 1,200 people passed. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I bet. And knowing that he built that from scratch was an amazing thing to watch. So and the beauty of Black conventions is, of those 1,200 people, I sold in 800 of them. You know what I mean? That's the beauty of Black conventions. That's the cool thing about I think focusing on a niche, is that you're building your own base, a base that is sort of dedicated and interested. There's an interest in our work, where if we're at a more mainstream convention, we have to wade through, and there's nothing wrong with a little competition. We're the kind of guys that will pull people onto our tables and onto our product, regardless of what race or regardless of who you are. But at the same time, nothing feels like home. You know what I'm saying? Nothing feels like that. So yeah, I those are my top, what did I list? 4 or 5? Those are like my top 5. Right.
And so and so yeah, and what I'm interested in, sort of back to the olden days, right? Is what was it like without having access to like a diamond, and I know you're selling stuff online on cons. What was it like trying to access? What did you have to do without a distributor to access a comic book shop or a bookstore?
You have to
You
go.
have to physically go there. You have to physically go there and pitch to the owner of that store, or the buying manager. I mean,
Right.
it was boots on the ground. It was leather. Actually going store to door. At least when I first started in 2006 with Force Galaxia, I went to probably every comic book store in the LA area and talked to someone about it. Now of doing that, only about 10% decided to carry my book. But that was great, for me at the time, because I didn't have the knowledge of how good the internet was going to be for sales once it came.
So one of the whole points of a distribution system is that it allows for you to focus on making the book and not spending days upon days marching around and trying to convince people to carry the books. I'm assuming then you got to deliver the books by hand, and then you've also got to collect money, all that kind of stuff, right?
Correct. So at Bic, it's our job to get the book out to the retailer and to entice the retailers enough to want to get this catalog of books. So we're constantly contacting retailers and spreading the gospel of Bic Distro, and it's our job to kind of take those reins, not necessarily out of the hands of creators, because we encourage creators to do whatever they do to get their books sold, but to kind of push that forward to help that along.
Right. Yeah, because I think once we get stores buying one of our books or a couple of our books, we can entice them to buy new books from our distribution, and that only helps other creators who get into our catalog to be able to get their books out there more. And it's like a snowball effect. I imagine once we start getting more and more books going, and if one of our books takes off, if a Kid Carver's becomes a successful animated thing. And then I imagine, Bic will get such a reward from that other creators will also get part of that, that love. So,
So part of the goal for a distributor, right, is to get more people to sign on for you to distribute their books. So that way, when you show up at a comic shop, it's not just Andre selling Andre's books and Jason selling Jason's books. It's Andre and Jason selling their books and 18 other people.
Right.
So you could, and then you can, so there's economies of scale.
Right.
And so everybody benefits. And then the way it works is that as a distributor, you get a slice of the sales, of the overall sales of all the books combined. So that's what makes it worth it for you to do it.
Right.
And that's where the value comes in, because then you guys can focus on new innovative ways to get books to people.
Right. Well, so originally this whole idea actually came out of a crazy idea I had so I had talked about how we were at conventions and people say they couldn't find our books. So I was always like, what can we do to get this out? Before I thought of before we came into the distribution system, and I had approached Jason about doing an infomercial, because my idea was like, well, with these grannies and aunties who bring their kids and grandkids and nephews and nieces to conventions, how do we reach them? How do we let them know that these books are out here? And I was like, well, what do old people do? They watch, television. They watch, I think about my mother who watches infomercials and that kind of thing. So my idea was to have like a Time Life type infomercial that focused on Black indie comics. Now, after doing the research, it kind of was cost prohibitive to do it. But that's how Bic kind of grew out of that original idea for me.
Right, absolutely.
And so I mean, and since you get to focus on where this niche goes, you can emphasize, you can go to places that say a diamond wouldn't bother to go to. Right. I mean, so are there outlets that you're reaching out to that are outside of comic book shops and comic conventions? Are there other outlets that you want to share with us that you're seeking?
We're seeking barbershops and beauty salons. I really think there's an opportunity there. Back in the day, speaking of the olden days when we went out places to get haircuts, when you'd go to the barbershop, there'd be reading material there, and it'd be 5-10 magazines or whatever. And what we want to do ideally is get like racks inside of these places and set up, like a subscription, deal with different shops and stuff like that. Like, I feel like we want to go to where the audience is, and what better place to, consume a comic or a magazine than waiting at the barbershop, or waiting at the hair salon. So, and there's a lot of kids, you got to bring your kids, every other week to get their styles done and whatnot. And we have a lot of books that are geared towards kids as well. So one part of our initiative is to try to get to make it feasible for those shops to mess with Bic Distro. Yeah.
And so I mean, it's interesting because we're talking about this in the midst of a pandemic that ground segments of the comic of just the comic industry to a halt.
Right.
Like
right.
I, for one, at the beginning, I remember the beginning of 2020. I was so optimistic.
So many years ago.
So long ago.
Yeah, and I remember like the big complaint was that C2E2 was happening earlier than normal. It was happening in the last days of February. I remember it's beginning and we had BCAF and then C2E2. And when we were at C2E2, little did we know that was going to be the last dance as far as comic conventions. Like the pandemic hit, all the comic book conventions started dropping like flies. So what was it? What were the initial days, like the first couple months of the pandemic, like for the two of you as creators?
As a creator, it's strange. Everything was shutting down. We had just came off Black Comics Day. I think that might be the last show I did, actually, now that I think about it. And it was just surreal to kind of watch all that happen in real time. And in wondering what to do, I was like, yo, we have to focus on social media, because we're not going to be going outside for a few months, and I think initially everybody thought that by summertime we'd be back out, we had never experienced this. I mean, there was a lot of talk about the Spanish flu of 1918 and everything, but Americans are, I don't know, we have slow understanding. So we were like, I felt like we'd be summertime, it'll be cool, we'll be all right. And as we sort of slowly devolved, that was the impetus of Bic. I think around that time, Andre and I had already been talking about the infomercial, and then we, I started making a partnership with Milton, producing Changa and the Jade Obelisk, and doing like comics and whatnot. And he had a lot of good ideas about distribution as well. And Diamond shut down.
Right.
Diamond was like, we're closing the doors. Not necessarily, it wasn't going to die or anything, but they weren't distributing comics to comic shops. And comic shops were like, the direct market freaked out. Nobody knew what they were going to do. And that's why you've seen a couple, not just Bic, but a couple other distribution services popped up to fill that hole. And we thought it was a very real opportunity to fill that hole with books geared towards the Black community. Previously, historically, it's been hard to get into those shops, but with the sort of, and I don't want to make it sound like we were trying to capitalize off of desperation, but we were trying to capitalize off of desperation. And if those shops needed content, we wanted to serve them with ours. And thankfully, it worked out a little bit. Right now, we're serving about 12 to 15 comic shops.
Yeah.
We've
got a mailing list of about 500.
Yeah, we have a huge mailing list. I don't know where the come on, guys. Come through.
I know.
But so with the gaps created by COVID and traditional businesses having to shut down, we saw a unique opening, and that's exactly how Bic, that brainchild started. So as a creator, I just kind of saw opportunity. Bic isn't the only thing that I created. With the producers of Nerd Soul, Mike Young, and Legends Press, Quinn McGowan, we also started our own virtual sort of variety show / convention called the Rent Party. And again, because it was a pandemic, because we couldn't get out to shows, it was like, we need to focus on the digital space. And hopefully we can continue to do that going forward. But yeah, I mean, I think 133 Art sales have went up, and up from nothing is,
yeah.
it's not, you know what I'm saying? But people, because people are home, they seem to be consuming our stuff more.
Yeah.
And we're getting into the hearts and minds, hopefully, of developing a growing base because of the pandemic. So where, a lot of people had a lot of issues, and it's not that monetarily we're rich or anything like that. We're not making millions of dollars yet. But there was unique opportunities, and because we knew how to sell comics in a drought already, because being Black in comics is almost a drought of itself. We were able to slide in and create these new pillars, I think. So that's how it worked out for me as a creator.
Yeah, I was awfully creative actually during this whole process, because I had a couple of things on the back burner, things, the long-term projects I've been working on, and everything's moving toward fruition. I fulfilled a couple other books. I started a whole new book this year that hasn't come out yet, but I plan to bring out in the new year. For my screenwriting side, I've done really well. Things have been really good for me. I recently sold a show to Lionsgate, so things are moving up. Things are moving up during this pandemic. I don't know if they would have went as fast without the pandemic, to be honest with you. Just the opportunity to get to speak to a lot of different people and to have these Zoom meetings. Like, I don't think I would have had the meetings that I got through Zoom that ordinarily I would have had, having to go to meet someone. So it's made creatively for me, it's actually been really come to fruition, a lot of goals that I've been working towards.
So wow, this is great. I mean, and I think what's interesting, and what a lot of people, it's like when you say comic distribution, they're like, what is that? Why? And I think that like, to some degree, what we're really talking about is how you're able to harness numbers, right? That you sell more units if you sell with other people, right?
Right. Volume.
And if it's other people who have similar audiences, it allows you to grow your audience. I mean, what, and let's be transparent. We've all known each other for quite some time, right? And so we've had a chance to watch everyone's growth. I mean, I keep thinking of an interview at a Wizard World many years ago, many lifetimes ago, where somebody asked Devin Grayson, who's a comic book writer who at the time she was writing Batman. She was writing most of the Batman books. And someone asked her, how do you break into comics? And she's like, well, I don't know if I can tell you. And they're like, what do you mean? She's like, well, I could tell you how I broke into comics. I don't know if it's going to help you, because breaking into comics is kind of like breaking into a secret, a secret government base. It's like you break in, you get in, and they let you stay in, but then they make it so no one can ever break in that way again.
Right.
So with that in mind, what advice would you have for somebody trying to break into comics, and not just break in, because now anybody can make a comic, because we so democratized
Right.
the means of production. You know, you can,
Right.
all you need is an iPad Pro is a production studio, right?
Right. Absolutely.
You know, but the next step is, you know, after you make something, you got to get it out there. How would you recommend, what advice would you have for people who are starting their journey and are interested in getting into comics? What advice would you give that person?
Don't break into comics. Waste of time, right? and let me tell you why. Comics, the way it's set up now, it's hard to break in the traditional idea of that. Devin is absolutely right. They wall it up behind these folks.
Yep.
And some of these creators have walled it up themselves, right? So don't focus on breaking in to the industry proper. What you want to focus on is creating a product, you know, and for us creators and artists and writers and what have you, that means a comic, that means a story, that means animation, whatever. You know, it's as an artist, it's all the same to me personally. But if you want to break into comics, create your own product and then find an audience for that product. Grow that audience into a reliable base and then sell to those guys. That's your niche. Be Tyler Perry. You know what I'm saying? It is not necessary to break into comics and work a freelancer's lifestyle or even as a writer or anything, unless it is your absolute desire to work for a mainstream company and that's your road. You know, I'm not hating on that. Do that. But if it's your desire to sell something from your gut, like you have a desire to create this thing and you need to sell it, all you need to do to be successful at that is to find people that want to consume it and purchase it. That's it. That's the bottom line. I could never, the way I'm built or the way I'm set up or the way my art is set up, there was no avenue for me to get into the mainstream comic industry for whatever reason. I'm not necessarily blaming it on race and what have you. I'm just saying for whatever reason, that wasn't the option at the time. So what I decided to do was create my first book, One Nation, and go online with it. And that's what we did. We launched online. I didn't know how to launch a comic, you know? I didn't know how to launch a product. I just did it. And my friends and family, they were the start of it. They purchased issues, and I just kept making comics and kept telling people that I made comics. And in the midst of that, I was doing freelance work, and I would show that, you know, just push all your wares out into the conscious and just be aware as an artist, as a creator, that pay attention to who likes what and where do they like it, and keep pushing to those people, and use your opportunities. But building your own base. I remember Robert Kirkman had just broken off from Marvel Comics, and he did his Kirkman Manifesto, a video where he basically said, look, I thought I was going to be Brian Michael Bendis, but for whatever reason, I couldn't. So I created Invincible and I created Walking Dead. And he said, all you need is that 10,000 fan base. He said, off of 10,000 volume fan base, you can live, you can eat. I bought my wife a house, you know, So focused on that more than focusing on breaking in or needing validation or needing, what's the word? You don't need the validation from the mainstream to be somebody who sells products. That's a trick. That's a trap.
And it sounds like also if you can sell enough, if you have that 10,000 and you can sell enough books to survive from week to week,
right?
You have plenty of time to you have validation isn't as important. You can get your validation from the mainstream later because you can survive to that point.
Absolutely. If you're negotiating anything, you need to negotiate from a place of power. You don't want to come to anybody with your hat in your hand,
strength.
Right? If you can sell 10,000 comics and you're one person or you're a group of 3 people, like a team of 3 people, you know, you can eat off of that. You can build a lifestyle off of that. That's a good first step. So I think that is what creators should focus on, rather than, you know, asking somebody for a job. Or like, I remember it was rough, man, back in the day, going to Comic-Con and meeting with editors and meeting with art directors and trying to convince them that you're good enough. And only, I don't know, 1%, maybe a lot less than that. It's like comics is like the NBA. You're not Michael Jordan most of the time. Like, few people are Magic Johnson. So, and there's hundreds of people in those lines at Comic-Con. So it came to a point where I was like, I'm tired of waiting. This is what I want to do. And I just decided to do it. And along the way, this is not stuff that I knew initially. Along the way, I learned the base, the people that purchase your stuff reliably, that want what you're putting out there, is more important than being a superstar artist, because that fades and that might even go away. There's a ton of mainstream superstar illustrators, and I speak from, you know, the experience of an illustrator, because that's what I am at heart. There's writers will speak, Andre will speak for writers, but like, there's superstar artists that were hot, white hot, Nova hot, that have to do GoFundMe's now. You know what I'm saying? So it's better to build from inside and build out than build from without, because there's nothing in, and you're dependent on the system. So you have to keep kowtowing to the system. You know, and it's
great that you put it that way, because I remember when I first started doing my my research, I was talking with a very well-known editor at DC Comics, and you know, we're in his office, and I'm just asking general questions about comics. We're having this interesting sort of insider conversation, and there's this moment where he said a couple of things. One of the things he said was that if you took the number of people who are qualified to be an astronaut, to go into space, and you took the number of people who are qualified to make a comic, the people who are qualified to go to space have a better chance of being on the moon than the people who are qualified to make a comic.
Oh, yeah.
He said it's just numbers.
I would say the people that are qualified to go to the moon have a better chance of making comics.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, because it's something a lot of people want to do, right? Because the very origins of the medium is that it's a way to tell a story, a way to tell your story with a relatively low barrier to entry, right?
Right. Supposedly.
So, you know, pardon?
I said supposedly low barrier to entry.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, the other like numbers thing that put a lot into perspective for me was he said, you know, a comic book is, you know, for even the mainstream, right? If you're selling 45,000 units, you're doing good, right?
Right.
And most people don't realize that like even a really well-selling comic might move 100,000 units, right? And at first you might think, oh, those are pretty good numbers, but more than 100,000. I mean, that's less than the number of people at Ohio State football game in Columbus, a small city in America.
Right.
that it's instructive because and it points out issues of distribution, in that you're selling 100,000, say you're selling 100,000 units of something spread out over 50 states in a really big country, and
Right.
that means that you are spending a lot of money on gas.
Right.
Just to, you know what I mean? Because it's so spread out. You're not
Right.
so the direct market, like one of the things that makes it less accessible to an independent is that to justify driving copies out to everywhere, they can't, quite frankly, they can't afford to just send two comics to Iowa.
Right.
You know, two comics, it just doesn't do it. And I think what's interesting, what you guys bring up is is when you talk about what you're doing with distribution, is your strategy is very hyper local, right? I'm hearing you talk about 12 comic shops in and around Los Angeles.
Not necessarily. So
Yeah.
the comic shops are most of them are not local.
Okay.
Right,
So again, with innovation, with the internet, with social media, actually we're shopping to all around the country.
Okay. Yeah.
And sometimes
we've had
international.
orders from everywhere.
So the difference that there's two distinctions, I think, when we're talking about mainstream versus indie, and even versus Black indie, right? 45,000 is a decent for a mainstream comic. And also I urge creators, younger creators, or newbie creators, whatever you want to call yourself, I urge you to go to Comic-Con and pay attention to IVC2 and actually look at the actual numbers of comics, because we assume that comic sales are in these big thousands of numbers. Not all of them.
Right. A lot of them are way below that.
Right. A lot of low selling comics going on. And I say that to say, if Marvel and DC can get away with, Spider-Gwen or Venom or whoever comic at 3,000 copies, you should feel really good if you're selling 3,000 copies.
Right. Exactly.
And also that brings me to one of the other parts of it. If you're an indie creator and you sell 3,000 copies, and you're a team or especially one creator, you're doing all right.
Yeah.
You can eat off of that.
Well, and that you're right. That is the big difference. Is the overhead at a major comic book company. That comic book company has to feed 7 families.
Right.
Right.
Or more.
Yeah. So if you're just feeding yourself, you're okay. So and that's really one of the things I really love about the indie space is once you demystify it, once you once you get past all of what you thought, you come to find out that it is a little easier for you on your own to make a living. You just gotta, especially if you can make a couple of big scores, like a couple of big Kickstarters or whatever, that can really pump up your numbers for the year. We sold about, and this is just 133 art, we sold about 3,000 comics last year. And it's just me, and Kimmy is my partner, my wife. So for the company, for the imprint, that's pretty good, I think. Like, we were pretty excited about that. From, I think in 2018, we were at like 2,000 books. So it's going up, which is amazing to me. But yeah, like, I think now, before maybe it was a little different, but now, since we can utilize the tools of social media, we can go all around the country and it doesn't cost us a lot of gas. Now, it definitely costs us a lot of stamps, but even then, like, if you're working with a mailing service, or figuring out, how to navigate, the postal service and whatnot, you can cut some of your overhead down that way too. And
Well,
that's
when I say gas, I'm also talking about it metaphorically. Like that's
Right.
what that's actually the biggest cost in mail.
right.
Is
Absolutely.
the gas, right?
Right. Right.
And so, but I think what's interesting is also to be able to get at and to start to make these distinctions between the big two and the many, right?
Right. Right.
And also and the independents, because people, so much of people's perspective of this is a big two perspective. It's
Right.
like I'm going to make the next Spider-Man. Well,
Right.
maybe you don't want to make the next Spider-Man.
Exactly. Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like the overhead for Spider-Man, like you're saying, is way different than the overhead of what you might create.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, just as a thought exercise, I interviewed a mainstream comic creator about a book that he had been working on, and over 12 issues. And I was like, so how many people really worked on this? And they had one fill-in issue, and then but then it's like so you had the 7 named people, and the person I was talking to was an inker. I'm like, well, wait, I noticed that sometimes you subcontract out, like you get someone else to do it because you can't meet, so that you can make the deadline, right? I said, well, can you write those names down here too? And then we started it was just like a list, right?
Right.
We stopped counting at 27.
Wow.
I mean, and it was just because even the freelancers, they have an assistant. And then I'm like, oh wait, there's some in-house production people who came in and touched things up here, touched things up there. Okay, who are those? Okay. Oh, and so changed assistant editors. So you had 2 assistant editors over the course of a year work on this. And it was interesting how, like, in terms of the named people, it was much smaller than the actual people. And then when you start getting in the fill-ins, you start to realize that those 12 issues fed at least 27 people. And that's not counting people who work at DC who are so high up in the chain that they're not touching the book, but their salary still got to get paid.
Right. That's crazy. Like, I mean, and it doesn't have to work that way. I mean, that's just the mainstream way, That's
Right.
way it works. I mean, these indie guys are creating, I would say maybe the output is less, but they're still creating in a fast enough manner, especially these days with Photoshop and all the new technology, that in the same way, but with way less overhead and way less people. Like you don't have to, like our understanding of comics needs to change if we're gonna be independent. And I think a lot of people have adopted, like the people that are actually making a living at this, whether that's a part-time living or a full-time living, have come to terms with what they need to do to make the numbers work and pay the bills. But we definitely need to continue demystifying the idea that we have to sell 45,000 copies if we make comics. Like you don't have to do that at all.
No.
And
if you are selling 45,000 copies an indie guy, you should be very damn happy.
Ooh.
Well, yeah.
If you sell 45,000 comics as an indie guy, teach me.
Right, exactly. I'm a newbie.
But here's the thing too, with Kickstarter, which we haven't spoken about, people are selling
big numbers.
Copies.
Right.
Yeah.
Spike Troutman and Iron Circus Comics are doing crazy numbers.
Right.
And people, I always like to mention Spike in these kind of conversations because she's huge, but
well, not only did she break the mold, she made a new one after she broke it.
Exactly. So it can't, like you can do this without mainstream approval or mainstream validation or even mainstream money. Again, Spike found an audience.
Right.
And now she just serves them.
That audience,
That's the way to do it. For me, there is no breaking into comics.
But that whole thing is mainstream also. I mean, that's what Disney does. You know, Disney has their audience. They sell to their audience.
Right.
Right.
They're not trying to get, they're not trying to get the X-rated audience or whatever. You know, they know their audience and sell to it. You know what you're going to get when you go to Disney movie, or a Disney show, and it works just on a giant scale.
Right.
Well, it's also because a lot of comics are a serial medium. And as a serial medium, as a medium that's built to come out on a regular basis, it's about habit. It's about and that's where the language around relationships comes in, right? Because what it is ultimately you develop an audience and they're just going to come to you out of habit.
Right.
So as long as you don't really let them down,
right,
they're going to keep coming back.
Right.
Yeah.
And a part of building that audience, especially when you're competing with, in theory anyway, especially when you're competing with the white male audience, 18 to 54, is having a niche product that fills a need for another audience, right?
Right.
Like Smut Peddler fills a niche for people who want sex, who want alternative to mainstream anyway, stories in their comics, right? Like for bisexual people who want to see bisexual things, who want to see bisexual stories, who want to see sensual stories, for trans people who want to see stories about trans people doing things, for gay people who want to see stories about gay people doing things, for people who just want to see another their friends or their family, or whether they're LGBTQ or not, want to see that in stories rather than just, again, straight white male politics or straight white male superheroes or straight white male detectives, whatever. The point is, she serves those people, and those people are coming out to buy her books. And that,
right,
to me, that is the road for Black indie. Like,
right.
we need to super serve our audience,
right.
to quote Tyler Perry. That is, to me, that's the way that you move the needle. That's the way you change things. So I like to bring Spike up in every one of these kind of conversations because I'm so inspired.
Yeah.
By
how can you not be?
Huh?
Well, yeah. I mean, and I think that's, what's also interesting when you start looking at someone like a Spike Trotman is outside of like if you go to San Diego Comic-Con, and a lot of people don't even know who she is.
Right.
But she is doing incredibly well in terms of units, in terms of bringing in money. Anybody who's worked on a Spike Trotman project has gotten paid.
Right.
But if you go out into the mainstream, maybe no one's heard of them, but heard of her stuff, but she don't care because she's fine. She's getting the sales that she needs, and I think she's a perfect example of what you were talking about earlier.
Right. It does not matter the sort of fame of that all. The sort of it doesn't matter if you have your own audience.
Right.
You want, as long as, like you said earlier, as long as you don't let them down, you're still eating. And that whole revelation was inspiring to me as a creator, because for the longest time, being, especially like in the 90s and the early 2000s, being creator then, it's like, man, if I can't work for Marvel, I got to work for Image.
Right.
The only way through. And to have that revelation, to have people sort of show you that you can do it that way, is very important. And that way, more voices get out into the industry.
Right.
Because without people like her, you don't get to see the different voices that are creating those comics.
Right.
right? You know, and then that also inspires other stuff at the more mainstream companies, right? Like maybe without Iron Circus Comics, you don't get Lumberjanes, you know,
Right.
from Boom, or you don't get like Sex Criminals from Image. You know, you might that, you know, as quiet as it's kept, those things are moving. Companies like Iron Circus are moving the needle for indie into the mainstream in a way that I don't think a lot of people are even cataloging or talking about.
Right, right. Well, look, we are out of time.
All right.
we're kind of over time actually,
All right.
but it has been such a pleasure speaking with the two of you,
Thanks so
Jason
much.
Reeves, Andre Owens, the founders of Black Indie Comix Distro. Thank you so
Yes.
much.
Thank you.
Not a problem.
All right.
All right.